We're going to get started with this panel presentation on AutoClassification, and this is, I think, our first session. That's not going to be nothing against the sessions before this, but there will be no death by PowerPoint. So no PowerPoint presentations for this session. Just going to introduce our moderator, Sandy Xerxes from Valora Technologies, who's going to take us into the panel discussion with our lovely panelists. So, Sandy? Here you go.
Oh, thank you, Jim. I almost killed you there. Thanks, everybody. Welcome. We're going to do a panel on auto-classification, and as Jim said, no slides, all talk and interaction. Wow. So if people can't hear or can't see in the back and you want to come forward, by all means do. So why don't I take a second and introduce myself and the panel and the topic that we're going to talk about. So my name is Sandy Xerxes. I'm the president, founder, and CEO of Valora Technologies. We're based outside of Boston, so not too far from here. And we specialize in document data mining and auto-classification, which is why we're talking about this topic today. My panel that I have here today, I think, is a really nice spectrum of folks that you will see in the information governance world, as well as people at different stages of their career. So I thought that that would be a really interesting kind of spectrum for you to see. So I will start with Cliff. This is Cliff Dutton. He's the Chief Innovation Officer at DTI, soon to be Epic. Should I just say Epic?
You can say it.
I'll say Epic. And for those of you who might not know, DTI and Epic were the #1 and 2 e-discovery vendors in the world until they merged, now making kind of a super #1. And Cliff has an extensive background in e-discovery, compliance. I won't remember exactly your title at AIG, but I'm sure you'll share with everybody, and kind of oversaw some major efforts around regulatory issues and compliance and e-discovery over there. And then next to Cliff, we have Lynn Thompson. Lynn is just finishing up her master's degree at Columbia University in Information and Knowledge Strategy. If any of you are thinking about an interesting program, I'll just give a shout out to Kate, who runs it, sitting right there. I teach at that program, so Lynn is a data scientist by day, student by night, and she has extensive experience working with analytics and various types of algorithms. Next to Lynn, we have Colin Cahill, who's the Records and Information Manager at Draper Labs in Cambridge. If you don't know Draper, well, go Google it, but they're a pretty impressive organization. They're a major DoD contractor and have been for decades, I guess, at this point. And Colin oversees pretty much everything that I can think of related to records and information management at Draper. So we're going to dive in, and we're going to be talking about auto-classification. And just a show of hands, how many people were at the keynote just a short while ago with David Brown from the SEC? He had auto-classification up on the slides, which I had not met him prior to that. I did not, give him a plug for that. But he described a process that I actually really would not call auto-classification. He described a process that probably many of you in your organizations do today, where you have to literally manually classify every file or every email or whatever it is by using drop-downs and effectively different forms of data entry. If you are doing that work, it is not auto. When we say auto-driving cars, we don't mean get in, turn the key, do the steering wheel and the pedal. We mean get in and go like this, okay? I should know. I have a Tesla, okay? I know what auto, pilot is. Not that I have it. I don't. I'm terrified. Okay, so when we talk about auto-classification in here, what we are talking about is literally software doing the work, having algorithms, having AI, machine learning, call it whatever glitzy term you would like to call it, where software is analyzing the content of a file, and that file can be electronic or scanned paper, sort of newly electronic-esque, and then making decisions about what to do based on the content. So you have kind of a combination of effort, a sort of tagging effort that's determining metadata or creating tags, and then another effort that is making a disposition. Is it germane, let's say, for a lawsuit? Is it responsive? Is it under legal hold, or should it be? Is it past its retention? Should it be deleted? If so, how? You get the idea. Okay, and so I've asked these three, now that we kind of have common language around what exactly is auto-classification, to kind of share their experiences with us. So I'm going to do this as kind of a Q&A format. I'm going to ask questions, but at one point I'll open it up and you guys can too, so start thinking about your killer questions. Okay, are we ready? All right. All right, panel, how exactly are your organizations or your clients utilizing auto-classification? I'm going to pick on Cliff first.
Thanks, Sandy, and good afternoon, everybody. A little more background on what DTI Epic is, and maybe that will help with the context of the example. We're a billion-dollar corporation with 7,000 employees around the world, and we're the largest provider of legal services that are not law firm services. So we provide, in addition to electronic discovery, we provide court reporter services, we provide bankruptcy settlement, we provide notice for settlement of class action suits, we provide management services for the back end of law firms globally. So in that context, we're one of the largest processors of electronic information in the legal industry. So we get a lot of different touch points across that. And one of the things that I've found is that when people have a very large volume of documents or files, the natural inclination is to think of them as printed out. They're all a bunch of files. We can print them out, and we can figure out which one's what for our business purposes just by looking at them. And that's true. That's a perfectly valid way to look at documents if you have 10 documents. But if you have 1,000,000 documents, that's not a rational way to move forward and understand what's in them. So when we talk about auto-classification, one example I want to share is, let's say, for example, you have a financial institution that has a large portfolio of loans that are in bankruptcy, or the person who took out the loan is in bankruptcy, or the entity that took out the loan is in bankruptcy. You want to make some disposition decisions, and you want to make some reports because your regulators require you to do that. You need to look at a large volume of files. So if you have tens of thousands of these records, you might have millions of underlying documents that are germane to that particular challenge, and you could say, well, let's just look at them all. Let's assign some people in a team, wherever it is, here or in some other place around the world where the cost might be lower, and say, let's assign people to look at that. The first thing you need to do is say, what do you want the people to find out? You need to figure out the rules. You mentioned some disposition phase. During that disposition, you have to consistently follow some rules. You have to have a reasonable approach to say, we've looked at a large volume of files, and we've made categorization based on some rules that human beings decided. The rules don't make themselves up. The rules are to a business purpose. So once you design the rules, you can look at those files rather than individually with individual human beings looking and disposing of each file according to those rules. You can say, let's make that an algorithm. Let's extract data from the text according to some rules, and then we can have a more efficient way of categorizing into different buckets those 1,000,000 files, for example. That might make it possible to do in a reasonable amount of time. So if you have a deadline as a financial institution to respond to a certain request, whether it's internal or regulatory, you have to say, how much will that cost and how long will it take? So in a recent example, when we literally had tens of thousands of records similar to what I'm describing, when we looked at the analysis of what it would take to look at those files with just a straight human labor force versus what it would take to look at it both algorithmically and with some QA applied by human beings, we found that the cost associated with doing that algorithmically was about 25% of the cost of doing it all with human beings. We also found that about 2/3 of those files could accurately be categorized using the algorithm. So it's not like we expect auto-classification to be 100% perfect solution to everything. It's not. But when we start with a human definition of what the rules are, and we apply algorithms efficiently in a combined process, together we can achieve extraordinary efficiency. So that's an example of how we can use this kind of technology to achieve a particular business objective.
Thanks, Cliff. And I just want to pick up on one point, which is, and I get asked this all the time, which is, when is it a lot of data? And of course, that's a subjective question. But we are now facing a world. I'll give you an example. Someone I spoke to earlier this week, their organization receives 100 documents a minute. every minute, every day. So when you do that math, I think I did it right, it works out to about 700 million documents a year. That's new. Okay? That is the world that we are heading to. Not everybody's in that scenario, but a lot of them are. I'll give you another kind of data point, again, just from recent conversations, happened to be a large law firm, this one. Just their email traffic, they get 250,000 emails, either coming or going, every single business day. Okay? That is an awful lot to track. And we have created these types of problems with technology. We're going to have to deal with them using technology. So this is a good segue over to you, Lynn. Tell us a little bit about how a data scientist applies these types of technologies.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sandy. Again, my name is Lynn Thompson. I have a similar background to Cliff. We were talking in the green room. So I do have some banking experience, particularly in IT audit. For the most part now, my clients are in the pharmaceutical industry, and what used to take 1 to 2 truckloads of paper, new drug application submissions to the FDA, is now a quick click of an electronic process. But the volume of data is the same. Multiple lab results over several years, culminating in what will be sent to the FDA, is an enormous amount of work for humans to put in the correct folder. And trust me when I say the FDA is very particular about the classification of those documents. And they will send those submissions back. And the cost of that is potentially losing out to a market competitor. Because, as you all may know, rivalry in the pharmaceutical industry is fierce. There are often companies competing, developing a similar drug, sometimes the same drug at the same time. So it's critically important to get those submissions in as quickly as possible. AutoClassification helps us do that. As Cliff mentioned, we use humans to make those rules, align them to the business strategy. And I just want to reinforce the fact that it is an iterative process. It's not something that you can just set up an algorithm and walk away. You have to keep a check on that algorithm to make sure it's efficiently doing the work that you need it to do.
Okay, and Colin, I think you hold, if there was a kind of ranking of common titles at InfoGovCon, your title might be the highest ranking, the most number of people with a similar role. And so I think a lot of people identify with, okay, I'm a modern day trying to get my organization to go from sort of more of a paper orientation around records into a digital one. You have a fair amount of experience with that. Maybe you can speak to that.
Sure, thanks, Sandy. So Draper Laboratories, really, it's been around since the 1940s and originated from MIT. I started at Draper 2 years ago, and really, prior to my arrival, no one at Draper had ever paid any attention to trying to manage information. So thus, everything that Draper ever created since the 1940s still existed in at least one form or another, usually multiple copies of the same information. If anyone has ever been there, and Sandy has been in the office, so she can attest to this, it's literally, the office building is kind of like a rat maze. So there's lots of strange hallways that don't seem to lead anywhere. You get to a dead end, and you don't know where the hell you're trying to get to. And people have traditionally have stayed there for a long time. 30, 40 years is not uncommon. And probably in the same office for all that time. So paper, legacy paper records at Draper had stacked up. It's just a huge, huge volume of that. So we've been modernizing our office space, which means moving all these engineers out of their offices that they've been in for decades and like demoing the entire space and then rebuilding it into an open concept. So there's been lots of legacy information that has been siloed to really like one person who's been here for a long time. So we're trying to make some smart decisions on what to do with a lot of this physical information. So, some of it is just old and we may not need it. No one's ever going to reference it again. It has very little value. So we'll either shred it or get rid of it. While others, there certainly is a lot of value, and we want to be able to use that and understand it. We also have, as Sandy mentioned, we're a DoD contractor, so we do a lot of work with the Navy, the Air Force. We also do a lot of work with NASA. So a huge amount of our business contains very sensitive, classified information, lots of security concerns. So as we have identified sort of those paper records as we're going through and renovating all those office space, we're trying to also understand what we have, and using AutoClassification as we're digitizing the paper records, trying to build some rules so we can understand if we have security classification that we need to apply to this content, if there's know-how here that we do want to capture and try and surface for reuse. So there's a number of different ways we're looking to do that versus doing it manually using these tools.
And I'll add one more, just because it didn't come up in the conversations here, but a common use case that we're seeing now tends to come up when organizations are coming together or splitting apart. In other words, some sort of restructuring, M&A, acquisition, that kind of thing. And what happens in those scenarios is, of course, you have two different piles of data either combining or splitting apart. And that is usually a call to, it's a good kind of impetus for information governance that isn't always discussed. Yes, sure, we know breach is a big thing, and some sort of litigation. Those are kind of the ugly versions of when it's time to pay attention. But M&A or divestiture can be a very positive version of that. And even still, I'll give you an example. There are two huge organizations coming together. So you have party A and party B, their data has to come together, and then because of regulatory requirements, they actually have to split into 3 companies at the end. So you have 2 coming together, splitting into 3. That's quite a data management challenge, and it's going to be solved with a metadata analysis and rules. So just another one to add to the pile.
Sandy, if I can just add to that for a second.
Yes, sure.
It's a great example because it brings us from this sort of policy layer directly down into some technology, because when you say things like, normalize data across 2 different institutions, and probably from a data science perspective, you'll resonate with this, but we have to start talking about things like data maturity models and data quality and data taxonomies, and what do we mean by different data fields in different places. If you have to map every single data field and its content by hand across these volumes of data sources, you will fail. Right? Because that doesn't work. Humans are not good at high quality predictability and repeatability across a volume of tasks like that. We get bored. Computers don't get bored. It applies the same thing algorithmically to the same file, and at least you have a method that you can say has a reasonable level of consistency. So none of these processes seek perfection. They seek a reasonable level of consistency according to its business purpose. So in compliance, we might have one threshold for reasonability. In an M&A transaction, we might have another level of reasonability of completeness. In a litigation, we're going to have maybe a higher standard of what reasonability and completeness means. But you have to think about those things technically, and it gets into the weeds really fast. And it's important that it's not only policy, but it's also the data definitions that we're talking about.
Okay, so since that all these people are already in the room, I'm going to say you're at least partial believers in this concept, or you wouldn't be here. So since you guys are living it day to day on the front lines, talk to them about the gotchas or things that get overestimated or underestimated. Give us your battle stories and let them benefit from what you've learned the hard way.
I can attest to that. One of the things that I've learned as a data scientist is that you cannot rely on simply one model. It takes more than one model to build reliability. The more models you have saying the same thing, the more accurate your data will be, your metadata classification will be. Another thing I want to reiterate is this is not a silver bullet. This technology is not a silver bullet. It takes time and knowledge and expertise to perfect the algorithm. Companies such as Valora are amazing at generating these algorithms, and it takes time to perfect that ability.
Sure. No, I think the silver bullet point is spot on. Auto-classification is something that personally I've kind of been interested in going back to the late 90s when Autonomy, that company, first hit the scenes. So I found it fascinating. And even back then, there were a lot of organizations that were starting to try and dip their toes and test. It was certainly not perfect or even close enough to perfect to really be terribly usable, but it has certainly improved over the years, not to the point of being, again, the silver bullet. So you have to, I think there is a lot of diligence that needs to go into it up front. A lot of that learning, testing, and in our case, and I think in a lot of organizations' cases, what we're talking about is, lots of unstructured information that really it's a black hole. No one's quite sure what it is we have. So even if we can start to apply some algorithms and rules and policies, all this stuff, to try and surface and understand what's there, it may not be 100% perfect, but it can get pretty damn close if you do a good job, and it's better than not doing anything at all, for sure. Yeah.
Do you do statistical sampling every so often to make sure your algorithms are accurate still?
I think that's a very good practice. Yeah.
Absolutely. One of the things that we do, and I'm sure that Sandy does also, is statistically sample how these files are being coded. Are they being coded correctly? Is the metadata correct for this particular file? Is it a blinded or non-blinded study? Is this accurate for this particular data set? Is this a small device, which is a completely foreign type of clinical trial? Absolutely. And the sample size is not small. It's a large proportion of the data set.
100 documents, 1,000 documents?
I would say in the thousands.
I would second that.
Yeah. And this can be done in minutes.
In terms of gotchas, a little more context on my role at AIG that I had prior to my current role. I was responsible for AIG's e-discovery and legal policies around discovery and electronically stored information, and all of our vendors for AIG's requirements, which are substantial, but also on behalf of all of AIG's insureds globally. So that is what made it a much larger challenge. And AIG globally, mostly on behalf of insureds, spends about $2 billion a year on legal services. So understanding where those risks are was something that I learned about some of those gotchas through many of those stories. And I find that one of the gotchas when we talk about records management is that we all recognize that records are both an asset and a liability. The gotcha is that we tend to overweight the asset and underweight the liability. Right, so we really need to make a decision about the value of retention and force that down to the individual custodian level or user level or department manager level and say, why are you keeping this, and make an active decision to keep things rather than a passive decision to just keep everything because it might be worth something. And that's a natural human tendency. I got a whole bunch of stuff in my basement. So I understand that we tend to keep things that might be valuable, but the liability side of that, if you get into a dispute or a litigation or a regulatory action or even in an M&A situation where you actually have to look at that information and you have obligations to achieve a certain level of of completeness in your analysis of that underlying data, that can be very expensive. So the gotcha is underweighting the liability and overweighting the asset, and driving that decision-making into your organizations can help with that.
And again, I'll add one more. Something that I think gets underweighted is the notion that there are different applications, different data silos, call it what you want, for different purposes. And that didn't happen by accident. There are different tools that are better for different purposes. And that is not likely to change. So I know that there, maybe a couple years ago, was sort of a prevailing notion that if we could just get all the data in one place or into one system, then we'll be under control. I think that notion is pretty well dead, or should be dying, because we're quite the contrary. More and more opportunities for data collaboration or storage are emerging every day. And you don't have to raise your hands on this, but you can think it inside. How many are using something like a box or whatever just occasionally in an emergency when you couldn't get something to somebody any other way? She says, no, gold star for you. But I can tell you I've done it, because I was under the gun and I had to do it. And I quickly put it on a box and the other person got it and we quickly took it down. Okay, not the best practice, but very real world. The title of this was AutoClassification in the Real World. That's real world. And so this kind of multi-silo, multi-purpose, all things to all people is going to persist. So if we're going to get our arms around it, we're going to have to do so with that as an admitted starting point. Yes?
To that point, when you're doing this auto-classification, when you're talking about developing the rules, are you using a particular data set, or are you using those rules and the tools and then pointing them at the different repositories? Because it seems like that, that would be much harder to do, because the rules, it feels like you would have to develop the rules based on some knowledge of that data set already, even if it's like a generalization of the data?
The answer to almost all either-or questions, honestly, is yes. It's so, it is both of those things depending on your business purpose. So you're alluding to machine learning, where you're taking a large unknown volume of text and saying, what are the categories, right? And that is an application of some forms of machine learning, where you can use the algorithms to categorize for you what the natural boundaries are within that unstructured data set. And that's, an effective learning tool. It's like exploring your data set. But when it comes down to what are you going to do to create rules, in my experience, you have to know what you want. What is my goal? What is the either business purpose or regulatory purpose or litigation purpose? What am I trying to achieve? And e-discovery would call that a coding tree. What issues are relevant in that matter? The same issues won't be relevant in the next matter, so it has to be matter-specific definitions. In compliance, it might be something like, I was responsible for policies, a small number of policies at AIG. How many people here are responsible for policies or have authored them? Right, so a lot of us. When IAD, internal audit, comes knocking and says, are you doing everything that your policy isn't designed to do, that would define what that metadata should be associated with your using, for example, an underlying set of email to look for those metadata fields associated with complying with that policy. It would be in response to that particular business requirement.
Like a records retention schedule, but that's easy. What's more difficult is identifying. What's easy is identifying the stuff that is relevant to legal hold, because you have those, what you call the data trees, right? You sort of know the custodians or where the relevant data might be. The records is also pretty easy, because if you have a schedule, it tells you right there what you're looking for, or somewhat what you're looking for. But what's tougher is everything else. What are those things out there that have that business value that you want to try to apply or auto-classify for people and apply some retention to?
That becomes a question of what your data map is. Where are your sources? Where might that data be? There isn't one common repository of everything, as Sandy has said. It lives everywhere. So you need to decide the scope of what you're going to be evaluating, and if you want to use a records retention schedule as your guide for what you're looking for, you could certainly do that. I would caution that I've been a testifying expert on e-discovery in federal court relative to reasonability and completeness, and I've often had to confront the difference between policy and practice. So when we have a records retention schedule that says what people should do, they don't do that. So we have to make sure we bridge that gap for them, and we make sure the rules look for those things that we know should be retained under a hold policy, that we look for them as broadly as possible. But at least we're given some comfort in the e-discovery space that recent rules changes in the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure have given greater weight to proportionality and say, what are we looking for in the context of what's at dispute, and it's not a universal has to be everything answer.
I'll add one more thing to that, and I'll also count this as sort of underutilized, and that is the notion of the document type. I'm not talking about it's an XLS or it's a JPEG. I'm talking it's a cash flow statement, it's a hospital admission form, whatever it is, because document type is often the best indicator without any other knowledge to say, might this be useful or not? And again, the technologies that are stronger on document type are a good way to solve this unknown unknowns problem, which is really what you're asking. If you have no context and no purpose, at least start with what I call sometimes like the blood test of the content. Learn everything you can about it, and then make intelligent groupings like document type, like various topics or concepts, and then at least have a first blush to say, do I care or not, which is really what you're asking. So we have a couple minutes left. Oh, was there a question? Oh, go ahead.
So, from the panel, where is the state of the art of the technology in terms of dealing with this question where you're dealing with a set of data or a set of documents that are not within a confined, constrained context? They're not all of finance documents, or they're not all one or the other. They're a more general question. One example might be, how do you use AutoClassification technologies or AI technologies to sort through what's business related and what's not? The question issue that a lot of us face is trying to separate out business related emails particularly, but other documents as well, from non-business related. So that's a very broad area. You don't have well-defined categories. It's just a very broad question.
Go ahead.
Where's the state of the art on that?
From my perspective, it is my opinion that the predictive analytics and the algorithms behind this AI, they're extremely advanced in lots of industries. I can't think of any industry, actually, that this can't be applied to. And when I say predictive analytics, I mean using those rules, taking a document, using the rules defined by the business to put it somewhere, to do something with it. One thing that I want you to leave with today, if you don't remember anything else that I've said, I hope that you see that your COs are most likely thinking about their competitive landscape and how to gain and sustain competitive advantage. Using metadata is one of those tools. It's a strategy that you can bring to your CEO right away and find a company to help you do that. Having said that, remember there is no magic bullet for this. I want to touch on something that Sandy and Cliff said about undervalued items. One undervalued item that has been extremely profitable in the pharmaceutical industry is unused intellectual property. Most clinical trials don't go to fruition. They don't make it through FDA approval for whatever reason. They don't finish their clinical trial. But there's valuable data there that could be used to treat another disease or condition. So by running these rules and running these algorithms, you can seek out new drug therapies that you didn't even know you had.
Just to add maybe a little bit to this, the two questions that were last asked. And one of the things that we're trying to do is, I mentioned, right, it's on our file shares, it's kind of a black hole, right? Some folks have described it as a hairball or a wood pile, or there's lots of interesting names for it.
Do you want to cover that?
No. But so it's hard, right? In a lot of ways, we don't know what we don't know. So what we've tried to do as an approach is to start to again, sort of pull back the covers and see what's there. What are the people who've put the content into these repositories? How are they organizing it? What are the terms that they're using? And really trying to learn from that, which will help us come up with maybe document types to help drive coding. Again, we have security concerns, so we can use the algorithms to come up and try to hopefully identify sensitive content that may be somewhere that's not protected the way it should be, or perhaps there's IP that's sitting out there as well. So it is kind of trying to use both tools, both approaches, to get at the answer. I think that's what we're trying to do anyway.
So, sorry. The state of analysis for machine learning and text analytics is very high, but it's for text analytics. So it depends what your document type is. Sometimes we have document types like databases or file types like databases that have their own structure. Sometimes we have image file repositories that have different ways of looking at them. So if you're talking about text analytics, it's extremely advanced, independent of the source of the text. So we can ingest lots of different types of text, hundreds of different file types associated with text analytics, and come up with very robust analysis. So that's optimistic. But I don't want anyone to think that text analytics or auto-classification is some sort of magic. It's algorithmic, it's specific, it's driven by objectives, it's driven by rules that we set up, and it can be extremely efficient in achieving an outcome that we have to achieve either for a business or a regulatory purpose.
Okay, well, I think we're coming to the end of our time, but the panel and we will go into the kind of the breakout room or breakout area, wherever Jim tells us. Right across the hall. So if you have further questions, or you just want to talk to us or bring us your worst problems, by all means, please do so. Thank you guys very much. And thank you, panel.